صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد. If we can begin with a Surah Al-Fatihah for all the shuhada that have died giving their lives for us, both in Iraq and in Syria, please. Surah Al-Fatihah. Bismillah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الذين يتبعون الرسول النبي الأمي الذي يجدونه مكتوبا عندهم في التوراة والإنجيل يأمرهم بالمعروف وينهاهم عن المنكر ويحل لهم الطيبات ويحرم عليهم الخبائث ويدع عنهم إسرهم وأغلال التي كانت عليهم. فالذين آمنوا به وعزروه ونصروه واتبعوا النور الذي أنزل معه أولئك هم المفلحون. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First and foremost, our thanks goes out to the community for inviting us for these blessed and special nights. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we are successful within them and that the discussions that we have are going to be beneficial to you and I, inshaAllah. The series that we wish to present over these next 2 weeks is entitled Decolonizing the Muslim Mind. The reason for our discussion is for you and I to take a journey into understanding why the world is the way it is, why the world has these particular ways of living, and how you and I as Muslims fit into that world, and ultimately the system of the world itself and the system that Islam hopes to be able to present to the world. The entire series is going to be a commentary of this verse that we have started with and that we will use as the framework of discussion for each of the nights, inshaAllah, over the next 2 weeks. Let us read this verse together, inshaAllah, and try to understand what the verse is saying, and we will from there go into our series in particular, inshaAllah. The verse comes to us from chapter number 7, Surah Al-A'raf, verse number 157 of the Holy Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the mission statement of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. If you imagine every company, every major organization, maybe even the masajid and the Husayniyat around the world, all of them, when they are opened, have some sort of mission statement to them, which underscores the entirety of what they're trying to achieve and the way in which they're going to go about it. A company will say, this is our tagline, this is what we hope to be able to achieve. This verse of the Quran is the mission of the Holy Prophet of Islam and describes exactly what he ought to be doing and what the religion of Islam ought to do as well. And immediately by understanding what the Prophet of Islam was doing and how he did it and what Islam itself as a religion wants to be, you and I will be able to understand whether we are following that religion correctly or not. Because if the mission and the goal of Islam is X, and I am following X, then I know I am in keeping with Rasulullah and his mission and the religion of Islam itself. If the religion is X, but I am performing Y, then it knows that I am not in sync with the mission of the Prophet and the underlying mission of Islam itself. Let's have a look at this verse, inshaAllah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, الَّذِينَ يَتَّبِعُونَ الرَّسُولَ النَّبِيُّ الْأُمِّيِّ. Those who follow the Prophet, the Messenger, the Ummi, الَّذِي يَجِدُونَهُ مَكْتُوبًا عِنْدَهُمْ فِي التَّوْرَاةِ وَالْإِنْجِيلِ, whom they find written down, mentioned with them in the Tawrat and in the Injil. Meaning, Rasulullah was mentioned before in the Tawrat and in the Injil. What do? يَأْمُرُهُمْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَاهُمْ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. They enjoin towards good and forbid the evil. وَيُحِلُّ لَهُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتِ وَيُحَرِّمُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْخَبَائِثِ. What does the Prophet do? He makes unlawful to them the impure things. He makes lawful for them the pure things and makes unlawful for them the impure things. Here, the next part of the verse is the most important part of the verse that we are going to be speaking about, and is the entirety of our discussions over the next 2 weeks, inshaAllah. It continues and says that the Prophet does the following. The religion of Islam does the following. وَيَذَعُ عَنْهُمْ إِسْرَهُمْ وَأَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ. The Prophet and Islam removed the burdens from their shoulders, the difficulties that were placed upon them, and it breaks the shackles that were placed upon the people of his community. This main part is going to be the essence of our discussions over the next 2 weeks, inshaAllah. وَيَذَعُ عَنْهُمْ إِسْرَهُمْ وَأَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ فَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِهِ وَعَزَّرُوهُ وَنَصَرُوهُ وَاتَّبَعُوا النُّورَ الَّذِي أُنزِلَ مَعَهُ. And so, as for those who believe in the Prophet, those people who honor the Prophet, and those people who assist the Prophet in these two things, in removing the burdens and the shackles within society, what happens to them? النُّورَ الَّذِي أُنزِلَ مَعَهُ. They follow the light which has been set down for them. أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. They will be considered the successful people. Now, this part of the verse, this centrality of this verse, speaks about two things. That the mission of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam was to remove the burdens on the shoulders of the people and to break the shackles that were holding them back. Immediately, one would question, well, what do those two things refer to? When the verse came down and spoke about the mission of Rasulullah, that he was to remove the burdens and break the shackles, what does this refer to that the Prophet had to do? We will talk more about this tomorrow, inshaAllah, as we go into depth. But just to be able to give a glimpse of what is meant within this verse. The first, in regards to the burdens that were placed upon people, was the burdens that came from the previous communities, the previous religions. In the previous religions, there were times in which the followers of those religions would react negatively to the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as such, in order to make them disciplined, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reveal certain practices upon those communities that would have been difficult, more burdensome for them to have to bear. Think about the children of Israel. Think about Banu Israel. As a community, they were very much about issues of tijara and trade, to the extent that they could not find within themselves time to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and perform their obligations towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As a result, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala needed to discipline those communities, those people, because they were so much into their trade that they would ignore anything towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As a result, what do we find? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sanctioned a special day within the week and said, this day there is no trade for you. This day you need to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do nothing but serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Today it's known as the Sabbath. Why have that? Because they needed to be disciplined as a community because of the practices that they had within themselves. This would have been a burden for the communities until the end of time and was specific to that particular community. Thus, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed Islam, one of the things that Rasulullah wanted to do as a rahmatan lil alameen, as a mercy to mankind, was to bring a religion that was easy for the community to bear. Something that would not be difficult for them, something that would help them rather than discipline them very strongly in the way in which they were practicing. We will go into this further tomorrow, inshallah. The second issue is وَأَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought a religion that was to break the shackles that were upon people. What does this refer to? This refers to the practices of the society that were prevalent at the time of the Hijazan community. Now again, we will go into this quite much. We will spend 2 or 3 lectures discussing this one particular issue about what was happening within Mecca and what was happening in Medina. We all remember many headline issues of what was taking place. They would bury their daughters alive. They would perform tawaf of the Kaaba naked, singing, clapping and dancing. They would go to war with each other at the most simplest of issue for decades without even finding recourse to peace. Now, as a society, this had gobbled them up into these practices. The Hijazan community practiced these things without even thinking about them. It was second nature to them. A girl was born into their community, they would bury the daughter alive. There would be a practice whereby someone would do something against another tribe and they would go to war with each other for years on end without thinking about sulh and peace between them. As a community, these practices had shackled them so much that they could no longer become spiritual people. They no longer had good akhlaq within them. They were people that were overcome by the practices of the Hijazan community. The Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, came to break those shackles. The word that I will use consistently throughout this series to refer to this issue is liberation. The Prophet liberated the society from the practices that they were undergoing. Yesterday, they were practicing these evil things. Only a few years later, in the presence of Rasulullah, these were the most noblest of people that had ever been seen by mankind. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's religion and the practice of this religion had broken the shackles, liberated them as a community, so they were no longer practicing what they were practicing. This word liberation and this little sentence, أَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ, is going to be the entirety of our discussion. We will spend 2 weeks inshallah just looking at this one part of the sentence, أَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ, and trying to understand it as to the way the Prophet did it and the way it makes measure for today inshallah. We continue. And so this was the mission of Rasulullah. And those people who believe in him, those people who honor him, those people who assist him, those who follow the light that has been sent down with the Prophet, يعني the Quran, أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. Those are the ones who are going to be successful. Meaning, those people that learn to take off the burdens that were placed upon them. And most importantly for our series, those people who learn to liberate themselves from the evil practices of their society, أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. Those are the ones who will be successful. And this will be our discussion over the next 2 weeks, inshallah. We have titled the series, Decolonizing the Muslim Mind. Decolonizing the Muslim Mind. And of course, the title is a very loaded title. The words decolonizing has a certain meaning to it. It assumes a certain meaning that the Muslim mind has already been colonized in order for it to need to be decolonized. And so, I will start with that assumption, but I will explain how that is the case, how the Muslim mind has been colonized. What do we mean by the word colonized? What is colonization? If I said to you, Muslims have been colonized, you will say, hang on a minute, is that really the case? Have we been colonized? What does colony mean? What does colonization or colonialism mean? Colonialism means, or to colonize means, to control part or entirety of something in order to exploit it for your own purposes. To control something in order to exploit it for your own purposes. Think about this question for a minute. When we talk about the British colonies, when we talk about the French colonies, the Belgian colonies, the British, for example, colonialized and had colonies around the world. For example, we can say in India or in Hong Kong. Or for example, if we were to talk about the French, we could talk about the North Africans. We could say, for example, Morocco and Tunisia, and they colonized these particular areas. Or for example, if we talked about the Dutch or the Belgian, they had different colonies. What did they do with these colonies? They captured them, controlled them, either entirely or partially for the purpose of exploitation of their natural resources, of their minerals, in order to export their own religion, in order to dominate that particular region. Therefore, the title of the series suggests that the Muslim mind has been colonized, that the Muslim mind has by and large been dominated for the purpose of control and exploitation. Now that's a huge statement to say that Muslims, 1.6 billion of us, have been colonized by something. Moreover, not only have we been colonized, but that we need liberation from that colonialization in order to show that Islam is still alive and well, to show that Islam is actually working. Thus, what we mean to say is that Islam has been subsumed into a particular way of living, into a particular thought and practice that is very alien to the realities of Islam. That actually Islam today, in the way in which it is practiced, its overt nature, its outward, apparent, zahir nature, may claim Islam, but today the inherent batini practice of Islam is indistinguishable from some other form of living that has actually colonized it, without the Muslim realizing it. What do we mean? Islam as an overt practice is different from everything else. We have our fasting, we have our salah, we have our hajj. The Shia in particular have their own forms of outward practice, don't we? We have our majalis, we have our ma'tam, we have our ziyarah, we have ziyarat warith, we have du'a kumail, we have du'a Abu Hamza al-Thamali, we have du'a Joshan al-Kabir, and so on and so forth. The outward practice is distinguished. We cannot say that we are like any other religion or any other sect. We have something that is purely for ourselves. However, is the inherent practice, the internal practice indistinguishable from the internal practices of other religions and other sects? Are we different in terms of what we feed into ourselves from the rest of the world? Or by and large do we find that we live internally the very same as to how others live? If we do, then we need to ask ourselves, how have we arrived at having such different external practices, but the internal are very similar to the way in which the rest of the world actually live? This is something that has been predicted and warned by none other than Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam. Before he passed away, he warned the Muslim community that the Muslims would fall foul of practicing the very same practices of the Jews and the Christians, and that in the internal nature of ourselves we would be indistinguishable from the other practices. We may retain the outward practices of Islam, but internally the warning was there in the hadith about us following the practices of Jews, Christians and other communities. Let me mention two hadith in order to explain this. The first one I mention is from both Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. And the hadith is as follows. The Holy Prophet of Islam is narrated to have said, لَتَتَّبِعُنَّ سَنَنَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ شِبْرًا بِشِبْرٍ وَذِرَاعًا بِذَارِعٍ حَتَّى لَوْ دَخَلُوا فِي جُهْرِ ذَبٍّ لَأَتَّبَعْتَمُوهُمْ. He says, beware. He predicts that the Muslim community, you would tread the same path as was trodden by those before you, inch by inch and step by step, to the extent that if they were to walk or to go into the hole of a lizard, you would follow them into that. And the companions then said to him, Ya Rasulullah, who do you mean about these previous communities? Do you mean the communities of the Jews and the Christians? And Rasulullah said, who other than this am I referring to? Beware. After I die, the Muslim community would follow the practices of the Jews and the Christians step by step, to the extent that if you were to see that they were to go into the hole of a lizard, you Muslims would follow them into the hole of a lizard. What a phenomenal prediction by the Holy Prophet of Islam. Another hadith from Rasulullah is as follows, and this time from the Shia compilation Ma'ani al-Akhbar, in which Rasulullah is narrated to have said, Dabba ilaykum da'ul umami qablakum. You Muslims have been struck, you have been snuck up upon by the same plague as the previous nations. The same things that plague the previous communities are to plague you as well. And therefore he warns us of this particular issue. And so there is a dominant force today that the series will argue gobbles Muslims up into these practices of the Jews and Christians. Actually, by and large, our external practices are Islamic, but the internal nature is very similar to that of the practices of the Jews and Christians of today. How does that happen? How does 1.6 billion Muslims around the world, according to such a narration, by and large follow the practices of the Jews and the Christians? How does that happen? There has to be an overriding system that even the Muslims cannot break themselves out of. And as a result of that, we become gobbled up, swallowed by those very same practices. Think about this very carefully for a minute. Imagine you had been born 1400 years ago at the time of the Hijazan community, immediately prior to Rasulullah, or when Rasulullah arrived and announced his nubuwwat. We mentioned, and we'll go into detail tomorrow inshallah, about the types of challenges, but we mentioned, for example, let us pick one. We normally hear that in the Hijazan community, people used to bury their newborn daughters alive, correct? Why was this the case? Many reasons. Fear of poverty, hatred for women, embarrassment for having a girl. Knowing that a girl was so badly mistreated at that time, parents didn't want to see their own daughters grow up to be disrespected in such a way. And so they felt it was better to bury their own daughters alive. Okay, let me ask a simple question. If you were living present 1400 years ago in that community, do you think you would have done the same as them, or do you think you would have done something different to them? Just think about that question for a minute and answer in the heart of your hearts. If you lived 1400 years ago in Arabia and you had a baby girl today, na'udhu billah, tomorrow would you have buried her alive? Many people will say, no, of course I wouldn't have. No way I would have done that. What kind of absurdity is this? I have morality and I have got consciousness, and this is an abominable action. I would never have done this. You know, the only way to objectively know whether you would or wouldn't have been following the practices of that society is to ask yourself, to what extent are you gobbled up by the practices of this society today? If you and I cannot break from the practices of society today, the ones that are just as illegal and illegitimate, just as immoral, just as bad for the human soul, if I cannot break myself from the practices of today and I'm gobbled up by the society of today and I'm doing what they do, then by God there would be no way that you and I would be doing anything other than what they were doing 1400 years ago. Had I had a baby girl, I would have buried the daughter alive as well. Had there been stones and sticks and mud and I had been told to worship this as my God, as an idol, I would have done the same thing today. If I am someone who is liberated from society today, I would have been liberated 1400 years ago. If I'm someone who is shackled by the ill practices of society today, I would definitely have been shackled by them 1400 years ago. It cannot be any other way. Can it? Now here, I want you to think about this society, this global issue of society and the way in which Muslims live and the way in which Muslims practice, and ask yourself, to what state and what extent is Islam as the religion today and the Muslim today different from the society that it practices within? I'm going to ask a couple of questions and I want you to think about these, and feel free to give me answers, inshallah. Help me with this first topic, just as an example, to think about society and the way in which society is today. When is the last time you went into Tesco or Asda or Morrison's or something of that nature? Or think about the next time you're going into Tesco's or Asda or Morrison's or something like that. Go to the cereal section. The cereal section, you know, in the morning's breakfast cereal. Just go to the cereal section. Let me ask a simple question. How many different types of cereal are there in the world? Sayyidina, when you went into Tesco's last time, you went to get some breakfast cereal or something of that nature, and there is, how many different types of cereal are there? Just pick a number. Be serious though, don't give me a crazy number, high or low. What's a serious number? 30, 35. Different types of cereal. Fair? Is there anyone that would dispute this figure largely? Is there anyone that would say there's much more or much less? More? What number of cereals are there? 50? What if I said to you, go up? What's the number? Go up. 100? Go up. 200? Go up. There are 387 different types of cereal available to you. 17 different brands, just brands, but of types of cereal, 387 types of cereal. Let me ask you a simple question. There are 387 types of cereal that you can choose to eat from. Yet 2 billion people in this world every night goes hungry and thirsty. How is that possible? Just think about this question for a second. Just cereal. I'm not talking about any other type of foodstuff. Just cereal. Here in the West, you can walk into a supermarket and you are so spoilt for choice, where there's 387 types of cereal, but 1/3 of this world tonight will go hungry. What does that show you? That there's an imbalance in the way in which we live. When is the last time you and we walked into that section of cereals and for a moment we felt that pang and disgust at a world so imbalanced, where there's 387 types of cereal, but 2 billion people in the world will go hungry tonight? Why doesn't the Muslim mind think about that? Why is it? Because we are gobbled up into a system that normalizes such waste, such extravagance, that we are born into that, and it doesn't even register that this is the case. Think about this. Right now in the world, there are 4 billion people. 4 billion people in the world that do not have access to clean water or to water at all. That's 2/3 of the world has to drink dirty water or walk so far just to be able to get water. In Karachi, in Pakistan, today, right now, there is such a drought that there was a woman who was interviewed by the BBC 1 month ago, and she said, "I get water once every 15 days. And the entirety of what I managed to collect in that 1 day of collection has to last me 15 days. She bathes, she cleans her clothes, she cleans her dishes, she bathes her children, and she drinks and she cooks with this water that she collects within the space of a few minutes to last her 15 days. Yet, on the other side of Karachi, there are people who have swimming pools filled with water. I ask a question. How has this world become like this? What system are we living in that is so dominant over the world? Didn't Islam have a solution to this? Wasn't the Muslim supposed to be living a different way? Or are we gobbled up into that very same society? Another interesting statistics. In the United States of America, by virtue of people's purchasing what they buy on a day-to-day basis, every American in the world, every American citizen has 59 slaves working for them. Slaves. If you break that down to the population, there's 330 million people in the United States of America. There's 66 million people living in the United Kingdom. Statistically, our buying and purchasing is the same as what the United States is. They do a little bit more, but we have similar statistics. That means that each and every one of us sitting in this room today, by virtue of our buying and what we purchase, you and I have 300 slaves working for us in the world today. Every one of us in this room has 300 slaves working for us. Half of them are children, and the majority of them are women. Half the slavery comes from chocolate and cocoa production in the world. But we are gobbled up into a society and we don't realize, but the practice that we do is no different to the practice of the rest of the world. We are not liberated. Islam is not liberating us the way Rasulullah liberated the Hijazan community 1400 years ago. Think about this very carefully. The world is teetering on destruction. Nuclear weapons, global warming. I ask a simple question. What is Islam's solution to these matters? Where are the books? Where are the ulama? Where are the videos? Where are the demonstrations? Where is the movement to awaken the Muslim mind to deal with the challenges that are facing us at this time? If Rasulullah was present here today, wouldn't the self-destruction of society, such as global warming, such as having nuclear weapons, be at the forefront of his agenda? Wouldn't something like 4 billion people not having access to water, wouldn't that be at the forefront of his agenda? Wouldn't you and I having 300 slaves per person in Britain be at the forefront of his agenda? Or would he just want you and I to pray and to fast and go on hajj and go on ziyarah and pay our zakat and our khumus? This question is the centrality of our discussion in our series. To really understand what has happened and the way in which the Muslim community is practicing the way in which they practice. What will our discussion be? What will our series look at? We will look at 4 overriding topics, inshallah, over the next 2 weeks. The first one is to understand the mission of Rasulullah and the way in which he practiced and how he liberated the people of Mecca and Medina. What were the specific challenges in Mecca? What were the specific challenges in Medina? And how did Rasulullah liberate? وَأَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ. How did he liberate the people of Mecca and Medina? Number 2, what is that system of the world today that makes us live the way in which we are living without us even realizing the way in which we are living? That started in the 17th and 18th centuries, known as the Enlightenment era. What is the history and development of that? Third, how does that movement today keep us distracted from making any genuine movement within the world? There is a term for this called bread and circuses that was employed from the Roman community that we will discuss, inshallah. And lastly, we will ask, how does Islam become gobbled up by these practices and dislodge Islam in the haqiqi sense, in the truest sense, and make you and I practice the way in which the rest of the world is actually practicing? Inshallah, this will be our series over the next 2 weeks, and you and I will try to journey through this discussion to identify how the Muslim world has become colonized, how the Muslim mind has become colonized to practice the very same practices that the rest of the world is practicing. And inshallah, we will talk about our solutions for the individual and for the community, so that from tomorrow, when we finish Shahr Ramadan, we don't just have fasted physically, but we have learned how to live in accordance with the ideals of an Islamic sociology. And inshallah, we will have a more pure way of understanding our presence within the world. Walhamdulillah.